Welcome to Cooking to Feast. Today we're looking at apples and we got a double feature for you. That's right, apple tart and apple dump cake. That is 2 for the price of 1. So here's our ingredients. We got, of course, apples, eggs, flour, sugar, butter, all that kind of stuff. Nothing that you wouldn't expect for a dessert with apples. Well, here's a big overview, but we're going to start with the apple tart, and we're going to make a tart crust. And again, this isn't a pie crust, this is a tart crust. So we're going to start with our 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, and then, whoa, here's the big difference. We got powdered sugar that we're putting into this, 1/3 of a cup, and then salt, that's normal for pie crust, but we're just going to use the food processor now, and we're going to use it to blend up all the ingredients and make sure it's homogeneous. So once you do that for a few seconds, I want you to add your cold stick of butter in here. And we're going to process this up until the butter is into extremely small, fine pieces. You'll know it's ready when you see the no more butter running around in there and it's all smooth. So once you finish, it should look something like this. Look how fine and powdery it is, but you'll see these tiny little butter morsels in there. That's good. That's what we want. To that, we're going to add 1 egg yolk. No whole egg, just the yolk itself. This is another difference with the pie shell. And then we're going to add our vanilla extract. And then for our final ingredient for this tart, we're going to use 2 teaspoons of milk or heavy cream and blend them together. You should get all these little tiny little pieces, and that's how you know it's done. The trick here is that once you kind of squash them together a little bit, that it forms into a nice dough. And so that means it's done, because you saw it there. It formed into a nice dough. All right, so next part, we're gonna have to chill this dough out. So I suggest, while I have the clean hands right now, get your dough out and first put some plastic wrap down. So that's what we're gonna cover it in. So I'm using a bowl because I need to really form this into a nice shaped disc before I put in the plastic wrap. We're gonna need to chill it. I'm doing it overnight, but you know, you can get away with like 2 to 4 hours or so just to make sure it's nice and cold and is homogeneous. So cover it up, take your time, make sure to get all the air out, and then place it in the refrigerator. So for this, I'm using 5 large apples. You can probably get away with using 4, and then we're gonna slice these up. I like using this Chinese cleaver because it is good for chopping, really good motion for that. I'm using more apples today just because I need to pick the best ones for you all. And so I recommend cutting the apple into quarters and then taking the core out. And then the way I've done it is that once I've cored it, I have a nice flat surface that I can place the apple down and cut these very thin slices. It's safer this way, and it provides a flat surface from the bottom of the apple so I can get consistent results without trying to chop my fingers off. So here's another look at it. You'll see that the apple is a lot more stable this way, and it's going to allow you to get even and thin cuts. We're probably looking for somewhere in the 1/8 of an inch range. You don't want them to get too thin and too thick. I know it's like a Goldilocks zone. So to this, to make sure our apples don't brown, we're going to add a tablespoon of lemon juice to it, and I'm just going to squirt a little bit more in there. What we're doing here is trying not to get them to discolored, but we're also adding a little bit of acidity and flavor to the tartness. To that, we're going to add a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, and then we're also going to finish the sugars off with this with additional 1/4 cup of white sugar. To this, we're going to add our seasoning, so cinnamon, 1 teaspoon, and then finally 1/8 of a teaspoon of ground nutmeg. So this is your traditional flavorings that you're used to when it comes to any kind of apple dessert, which is the sugars, the cinnamon, and the nutmeg. I'm putting this all into a large stock pot because we're going to cook these down. To get the nice pattern in the tart, we really need it to be flexible. So we're going to basically pre-cook some of this pie, or this tart. And so cover it up on a medium-low heat. Stir it every once in a while. You're going to continue this process until the apples themselves are slightly flexible for your tart. In the meantime, we're going to roll out our tart dough. And for this, I'm using an 11-inch tart pan. You can use other things, but I mean, it really helps add with the nice visual aspect of it. When you start rolling it out, I suggest putting it between 2 pieces of parchment paper. This dough is very delicate, and so it has a tendency to crumble and break apart easily. The parchment paper helps that. Once you're rolling it out, keep turning it until so you have a consistent shape going. Feel free to mash it back together like I'm doing here so that you don't get weird shapes or that it breaks apart. Once you have enough dough, for the pan itself, put some non-stick on there, and this makes just enough for the pan itself. Even when you're rolling it out, use the parchment paper to help you, because this is a very delicate dough and it will fall apart. But once you get it onto it, don't worry about it, because you can really just like mash it together, because there's not a big overhanging crust on this. You don't have to worry about making it look completely pretty or perfect on there, because we're going to put the apples in there and you won't even see it. But just make sure you have actual crust in there. That's all you need to do. All right, so now we got our finished crust here. It looks pretty good. Like I said, it's not perfect, but you're not going to be able to tell. Let's take a look at our apples. They are now flexible enough, so we're going to pour these out, and we got to cool them down a little bit, and you'll see all this juice that's coming out of them once we put it into a bowl. And see the steam. I mean, these things are hot. I'm not touching them yet. So what I would suggest is put some parchment paper down, spread them out. This way you can see your best pieces, and it'll also cool them down. Take your crust, put it next to it, and you'll see here, this is the flexibility we're looking for. It's not breaking apart, but it's also not soggy. You're going to want to place your apples on the edge and start on the outside. Then grab your next apple, and you're going to want to put it about 1/3 of the way, covering it up. And you're just going to work your way around. This part, there's nothing fancy, there's no tricks, no nothing to this. I did a few more apples so I could pick the best looking pieces for this video. Don't really need to be choosy or anything on this. So this is going to take some time. Just keep taking apples, layering them around, and eventually you'll start coming together like this. And then for your final piece, the inside of the rose, curl it up and wrap it with another piece and then place it directly in the middle. And that's the overall technique here. This is what's going to get you that Instagram shot that you want. You know, put this nice looking thing up on Instagram, and it looks good enough to eat it. It is. Really, we still have to bake this thing. So you're going to start baking it at 425, and then you're going to reduce the temperature to 375 and cook for 25 to 30 more minutes. At this point, it should be done, and I wouldn't recommend any more time because we've already partially cooked the apples, and we don't want to brown the crust too much. So for all the juice that was left over, let's make a sauce or a glaze to go over top of this. Let's add a tablespoon of brown sugar to it, and since it's already in a pan, we're just going to keep using this one and put it on a simmer. Once the steam and everything gets released, it's going to condense down into this syrup mixture you see here. The more juicy the apples, or the more liquid that you get out of the apples, the more syrup you're going to be able to make on this. It's not necessary, but it's a nice little touch to it. So let's take it and let's drizzle it upon the tart itself, the apple tart. And it's a nice little finish on there. It looks good, and it provides a little bit more sweetness to the overall product. And finally here, what you're going to want to do if you want to take this up to the next level is just sprinkle a little powdered sugar onto it. This is just a nice little finishing touch. This dessert isn't overly sweet. It has a nice apple flavoring and a nice sweetness to it without being overly sweet. And there you go. Here's your presentation for your finished slices. You'll see the nice dough, crisp on the bottom. And that wraps up the apple tart portion. So we're going to move on to the apple dump cake. And here's where we're going to get really sweet. The first one, not as sweet. This one, very sweet. So we're going to start by making a cake filling. We'll start with 1 2/3 cups of flour, and then we're going to move on to 1 cup of granulated sugar. If you really don't want to go through this effort, just use box cake mix. It's not that big a deal. For this, we're going to add 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. This is going to help give some lift or some rise to this, and then we're going to add 1/4 teaspoon of salt. This whole thing, it's not really going to work the same as like baking a cake, but it's going to create like more of like a streusel topping on top that interacts with the water and creates like a somewhat cakey somewhat streusel-y type of topping. So for this, whatever baking dish you're using, I recommend 6 to 10 apples. So I put them in there and you can see how many apples I'm using, and that's a good way to guess on it. To cut them up, we're going to be using the same technique as before. I cut them into quarters, and then from there, lift it up and cut the core down. Again, this knife is a real good addition for that because it has a great chopping motion. This gives you a nice flat bottom to work with. And unlike the previous, the Tart one, where we cut into very thin strips, now we're going to do thicker ones, so maybe 1/4 of an inch or more, because these are going to cook down and we don't need the flexibility for those thin strips. So for each 1/4, we can probably get about 4 pieces. Again, cut the core out and it leaves you with a nice flat working area. And here's another angle again for it. You don't have to be precise, but try to keep consistent cuts and try to keep them into that 1/4 of an inch or a little bit more area. Once you have enough apples, you're just going to put those into a bowl, and we're going to do the same process as last time. We're going to add 1 to 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, depending on how big your cooking pan is and how many apples you're using. Now it's time to add our sugars. 1/2 cup of brown sugar. And then additionally, 1/2 cup of white sugar for a nice blend here. Now it's time for our spices. Again, 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, along with 1/8 teaspoon of ground nutmeg. Don't use too much nutmeg. It might seem like not a lot, but nutmeg is very, very powerful. And you can substitute for fresh nutmeg, but be very careful with how much you put in. Additionally, we're going to add some cornstarch, or about a tablespoon's worth, to this mixture to imitate a pie filling. So for the dump cake, a lot of people like to use pre-made pie filling, which has a thick sauce in it. The apples are going to release even more water throughout the baking process, so this is going to produce a nice thick syrup so it's not a watery mess. And here's a close-up. You want to make sure all your apple pieces are covered in cornstarch and the sugar and spice mixture. So for this, I'm using essentially what is a lasagna pan. From that, we're going to add some non-stick spray to it because we're using a lot of sugar. And then dump your apple mixture, hence the name apple dump cake, right into the pan. And then just spread it out evenly. I mean, this does not take a lot of energy. This is a very fast and easy with great results. And there you go. Look at that. Looks good already. But we are not done. We need to feast here because we're going to add cake mix and butter to it. Take your cake mix and then spread it out evenly all over the top of it. So we're just going to create a nice layer on the top of it, and then additionally, this is optional, I just like to sprinkle a little cinnamon. You don't need any exact measurements on this. And I like to take a tablespoon of brown sugar and just sprinkle it on this. I want the sugars to melt into the top as well for more of that streusel-like effect. For our last part, we're going to take 1.5 sticks of butter. We're just going to cut those into pads, and then we're going to evenly place it on the top of it. And that's it. That's everything you got to do before you bake it. There's not a lot of work involved in this. No covering, nothing else done to it. Just bake it at 375 for about 45 to 55 minutes. You'll know when the top is looking done and it's all bubbly. So this is the finished product here. Looks pretty good. Look, you got this nice, almost streusel-like topping on it, and then you have the very soft and delicious apples underneath it. It's the combination between the two textures, that nice, real nice crispy topping, along with the gooey insides, which is what makes this a perfect fit. And it's going to be hot for quite a while. So I recommend getting a big spoon and just spooning it out into a bowl. And from there, you can add anything you want. You want to add some ice cream? That's always a classic combination, or some whipped cream, or just eat it by itself. And there you go. That's what you're looking for there. Look at those chunks of the cake mix on top with the awesome apples underneath it. Here it is, apple tart, apple dump cake. This is Cooking to Feast. I hope you enjoyed this and subscribe for more.